to get started.
Okay.
Yeah. But tomorrow, that's the program only for PhD candidate or master, not for professor.
All right, I think we're ready. Great, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the convener of this webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. The association's mission is to advance the research and application of the social capital concept, and the application is now welcoming new members. In this session, we welcome Solène for a presentation about coping with urban shrinkage, the role of informal social capital in French medium-sized shrinking cities. Solène is an urban scholar who combines ethnographic methods and critical theoretical approaches from geography and sociology to explore the everyday politics of urban change. She studies how urban actors' everyday experience and negotiation of urban change contribute to reproducing, transforming, and sometimes challenging unequal socio-spatial orders. Her PhD research examined the everyday politics of urban shrinkage, including residents' agentive mitigation of stigma, sensory micropolitics in impoverishing and ethnically diversifying neighborhoods, and construction and mobilization of urban symbols, and the role of public actors in recomposing social capital weakened by long-term out-migration. We're delighted you've agreed to give this webinar. Welcome, Solène, and over to you for the presentation.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Tristan, for the invitation and for the introduction. As Tristan just explained, my overall research focuses on the everyday politics of structural urban change processes. And my PhD was on more specifically urban shrinkage and shrinking cities. So this is how I became interested in social capital in shrinking cities. It was part of an interrogation on how urban shrinkage affected people and how they were able to deal with it. And the issue of social ties and social capital very quickly became a central topic in this research project. But since I'm talking to a social capital audience, before I say more about my research, I think it's useful if I explain just a little bit more about the kind of phenomenon that I was studying, urban shrinkage, to give you a little bit of background. So basically, what we're talking about when we're talking about urban shrinkage, this is a term that designates a multidimensional phenomenon of urban decline. So, which includes economic and employment decline and demographic decline, of course. So the main characteristics which happen on the which become a structural trend and happens on the long term. And it also comes along with other main manifestations or trends or dynamics, including a degradation of the built environment because of underuse or vacancy. It also comes with local financial issues because there's a decreasing tax base and also an impoverishment of the population. And in general, it's caused by in most cases, it's caused by a combination of deindustrialization, suburbanization as well, and metropolization, which is the agglomeration of people and economic activities in the largest cities. So unsurprisingly, this is a phenomenon which affected particularly Western industrialized or deindustrialized countries, and especially historically industrial regions. Like, for instance, the Ruhr in Germany, the Rust Belt in the US, or the northeast of France. And there's one important dimension of this phenomenon, which is important in the context of this research, and this is the issue of outmigration. In general, these cities have negative migration balance, so more people tend to leave. But this outmigration doesn't happen in a homogeneous way. It does not concern all population groups in the same way. So it's mostly younger people that tend to leave more, generally for study or professional purposes, and also middle class or upper middle class groups. And this has some consequences on the population's socioeconomic structure, in terms mostly of impoverishment and aging as well. So in this context of growing scholarly attention to this phenomenon, urban shrinkage, there's been also an increasing attention to the role of social capital in these areas. And mostly because it was increasingly seen as a potential resource for community-led initiatives, potentially an alternative tool for planning in these cities. And I will say a bit more about this perspective or this argument in a minute. But before I elaborate, I also wanted to specify how I use the concept of social capital in my work. So I follow a Bourdieusian approach to social capital. I use the definition by Bourdieu and Vacan. And I use this definition particularly because it leaves room for both the individual and the community level at which we can measure social capital, and also to more or less institutionalized social ties. And also precisely or relatedly, for the purpose of the analysis, I distinguish between two forms of social capital, formal and informal social capital. So the formal social capital, I understand as the resources that are derived from belonging and participating in institutionalized relationships, so or organizations, for instance, associational activities. And the latter, informal social capital, I understand as the resources that are obtained through belonging and participation in non-institutionalized relationships. So relationships that do not require formal or explicit acceptance into a group. For instance, friendships, neighborly relationships, family relationships. And making this distinction helped me make sense of the different scholarly approaches to social capital in shrinking cities that I was seeing and trying to connect. So I'll say more about this now. As I was saying just before, the question of social capital in the context of shrinkage has attracting increasing attention, but from different scholarly approaches, different scholarly perspectives. And in this research, I draw mostly on two approaches. So the first one is a more policy-oriented approach, which comes mostly from geography and planning and focuses specifically on urban shrinkage and shrinking cities. And the other one is a sociological perspective, developed particularly within French sociology, and investigating more like post-industrial towns or villages. So I will start with the first one, the policy-oriented approach. The dominant perspective in this approach is on how social capital can contribute to solve problems related to urban shrinkage. So basically, social capital as a planning tool to change the place. So for instance, these studies, they show how they show the role of social capital in planning processes to involve community members, or the role of social capital to address problems related to shrinkage, such as building vacancy. And in addition, this perspective also focuses on more collective and more formalized or institutionalized forms of social capital. So generally, it investigates groups that have been formally recognized as a community actor. It investigates or it analyzes their capacity to act collectively in an organized fashion to achieve a specific goal. While I don't deny the added value of the initiatives that I studied in this perspective, I identify some limitations to approaching social capital mostly from this perspective. So there are three limitations mainly. The first one is that it raises questions of social spatial justice because it advocates for transferring responsibilities to residents, responsibilities which in other areas, growing or wealthier areas, are supported by public or private actors. So it's also a discourse that can tend to legitimize austerity measures. Secondly, the second limitation is that social capital is not evenly distributed. So the risk of policies that rely too much on social capital for urban redevelopment is that it aggravates inequality within the city between communities that have different level of resources, different level of social capital. And the third interrogation I have is that there's research that shows that in the context of urban shrinkage, residents may not always be either willing or able to engage in collective action to address shrinkage for different types of reasons. So basically, this approach raises questions in terms of justice and effectiveness. Then the second approach then that I draw on, the sociological perspective, this perspective focuses on how people's daily lives and how their experience of place is influenced by social capital, and how social capital itself is impacted by the transformation of the place. So it's kind of the other way around. And these studies, they focus mostly on lower income groups, and they show that for these groups, social capital is strongly place-based. So it's locally anchored, place-dependent. And in French sociology, this type of social capital is called capital d'autochtonie. So autochthony capital, basically the capital derived from being from there. And also, unlike the policy-oriented approach, these studies tend to approach social capital more individually and informally. So for instance, they will show how belonging to a close-knit network of friends will give you access to hustles and side jobs that help supplement one's income. And here as well, there's also one limitation that I identify, which is that this perspective tends to focus on social capital, or it focuses on how social capital works for individuals who have a strong social network and high social recognition. And it does recognize that some individuals are much more isolated, but this aspect constitutes more of a blind spot in this perspective. So the fact that it's unevenly distributed and some people are excluded from these this bonding social capital, basically. So with this background, what I wanted to understand was how various forms of social capital are transformed in the context of shrinkage, but also how they are used and how they can help inhabitants. And I wanted to also understand how this involves residents, but also possibly other urban actors. So what I argue in the research is that the two perspectives need to be connected, and we need to acknowledge both forms of social capital, not overly focus on one or the other, but we also need to look at them together to see how they interact, because they do not work separately. So before I start presenting the results that lead me to this argument, I'm going to very briefly present the places where I conducted my research and how I conducted it. The analysis, for the analysis, I draw on two ethnographic studies. So I used ethnographic methods, but in this research, more specifically, I rely on the semi-structured interviews I conducted. So I conducted 110 interviews between 2020 and 2021, mostly with residents, but also I conducted expert interviews. And the two case studies are two medium-sized cities in France called Nevers and Dieppe. So Nevers is the red dot in the center of the map here, and Dieppe is the red dot in the north on the coast. And both cities have been shrinking since the mid-70s approximately. And they both lost, so they're both about 60,000 inhabitants for the whole agglomeration. And both of them, for the inner municipality, they lost about 29% of their population since the 70s. So for Nevers is located in a rural region. It's a city that had more of an industrial and commercial character, with industrial towns surrounding the city. And it suffered from several waves of economic decline, but also from the reduction of public services, especially since the 2000s. For instance, there was a military garrison that closed in 1999. And as for Dieppe, it's a port city, and it suffered from both suburbanization and economic and employment decline, and mostly from the decline of the commercial activities of the port. Okay. So now I'm coming to the analysis, and the analysis is structured in three parts. So basically, first, I examine the transformations of social capital in the context of shrinkage, and I show that it tends to weaken. Second, I examine how social capital constitutes an important resource for the residents who have a strong social capital, so it's definitely not something to overlook. And finally, I examine the interaction between formal and informal social capital, and I show the role of more institutionalized social actors in the community to foster both formal and informal social capital. So we'll start with the first part. And the first thing we can see is that social capital is indeed quite affected in the context of shrinkage. And more specifically, it tends to diminish or to weaken, mostly because of outmigration and impoverishment. And outmigration is really the main factor here. So first, outmigration, for the people who remain, well, this results in a weakening of social networks. And this, as I said, outmigration is selective. So this concerns some population groups more than others. And it's particularly elderly people that are affected. So basically the people whose children or grandchildren have left the city. And particularly elderly people who live alone. And maybe probably because of life expectancy reasons, I met many women in this case. And for the people who are in this situation of weakening or dismantling social networks, this is mainly felt through increased isolation and loneliness. So this shows how the weakening of social capital is not just felt collectively in terms of decreasing capacities to initiate community-led projects, but it is also felt individually in terms of well-being and experience of place. And I'll just add that to a lesser extent, I also observed this for younger people who were new to the city, because there was a high turnover of young people coming to the city for professional reasons, but not staying, sorry. And so a lot of people who arrived in the city struggled to make durable connections because they were in the age range where people were leaving. Then regarding impoverishment, this is a little bit less straightforward and less easy to observe. This time it's not really related to the strength of one's social network, but rather the access to social networks and social opportunities. So I could observe this in some cases when it was explicitly mentioned to me, that the limited financial means also meant limited access to social activities and limited access to make new social connections. Basically, this is when you have to pay for engaging in social activities. So this is something I observed less often, that was also described less often by participants, because I think it's less straightforward. But since impoverishment is one of the main dimensions of shrinkage, I think this is still quite a significant element. So the first result, the first part of the analysis confirms that we should approach it with caution when thinking of social capital as a ready-to-use tool for policy and planning in shrinking cities, because as this shows, it is indeed weakened and diminished. That being said, and this takes me to the second part, the fact that social capital is weakened, that doesn't mean that it's inexistent. Now I'm turning to how it helps people coping with some of the difficulties related to shrinkage when it's there, basically. And I could definitely identify that it does constitute a critical resource for individuals who have this place-based social capital, that the one I was describing earlier, the capital d'autochtonie. But from what I could observe, the benefits accrued more at the individual level rather than at the collective level. So in what I observed, it did not so much help the community as much as it really helped individuals in their individual trajectory. So this point, I illustrate this point using a specific example of a participant. So it's the case of a young man who is in his early 30s. And he's from a working class background, family long established in the city, working in the port activities, fishing industry, and in Dieppe. And so he left the city to study, and he started a career as a graduate elsewhere. But then after a while, he decided to come back to his hometown because he privileged social well-being and his social network over the career. But this return to the hometown came at the cost of his professional trajectory, because he had to quit his job to come back, and he couldn't easily find an equivalent job in his hometown. But then on the other hand, locally, he had a very strong social network, a very strong social capital, which he nurtured also over the years of being away. And eventually he was asked he was contacted by the mayor, and he was asked to join the list for the municipal elections. And he became a municipal delegate, and now he has political responsibilities. So basically for him, the return to the hometown meant a trade-off between different forms of capital. It meant giving up on economic and symbolic capital, so basically giving up on his career, but regaining but more social capital. And he was able to eventually convert this social capital into back into symbolic capital. This time not through his profession, but through his political responsibilities. So what I find interesting in this, in his case, is not that it's representative, because the trajectory of young graduates who come back to the city is quite the exception, not the rule. But it does show in an exemplary way how social capital can become a critical resource to navigate different forms of capital, especially in the context of a shrinking city. So basically, his example suggests that rather than functioning directly as a tool to solve community level problems, social capital can definitely help individuals in their trajectory. So basically, to simplify, trying to solve residents' problems rather than trying to solve the city's problems. And it also shows that it can be a critical resource, but the benefits are not necessarily like the most direct. It can be in indirect ways. So the question that then comes up is, how does that play out, considering the uneven distribution of social capital and its weakening? How does this play out for people who do not have this strong place-based social capital as this young man that I was talking about? And this brings me to the last part of the analysis. So what I examine in the last part of the analysis is, as I announced earlier, the interaction between formal and informal forms of social capital. And this brings out the role of more institutional social actors in fostering social capital, and especially for the people who are more isolated and who have seen their social capital weaken. And I could observe this in particular in a community center where I conducted part of my research in Nevers. The community center was a source of social capital in two different ways for the people who went there. First, it was a source of social capital in a more formal and institutionalized way through the activities that it organizes. So that corresponds really to the more official goal of the community center, which is officially to foster social connections in the community. And here in particular, there was one specific profile of participants which was quite frequent, and they were quite sensitive to this function of the community center. And this profile corresponded to middle-aged or elderly women who had experienced a difficult life event, like a divorce or becoming a widow or an illness. And for them, coming to the community center was a way to start anew and to rebuild a social network after a period of social isolation. They described very clearly the benefits of this in terms of mental health and social well-being. But then secondly, and in a more informal way, what I also could observe, maybe less often, but still in several cases, was that the center then served as a basis to rebuild a more informal network of friendships and to rebuild a social life beyond the center. And here, in this case, in addition to the benefits in terms of well-being, the participants also described the development of mutual support networks. So more concrete benefits, for instance, help to buy groceries, help driving each other, for instance, to medical appointments, or checking on each other in case of illness. So this second part shows that social actors like community centers, they act as a kind of safety net in this context of weakening social networks. And they provide both collective and formalized, a collective and formalized organization, but they also help people build informal social capital, which helps them more at the individual level. So it works in parallel, basically. And this brings me to my conclusion. I want to conclude with some of the key ideas of this presentation. for the anecdote, the picture that you see on the conclusion, it's a project that the community center tried to set up of a more formalized way to enable mutual help and mutual support. And what I found interesting is that this initiative, which was much more organized and formalized, didn't work. So it worked for some people who had built these informal ties through the activities of the community center. But when the center tried to formalize and let's say scale up such mechanisms, it didn't work as well, and partly because the community center switched to a more top-down approach to that kind of project. Anyway, back to my conclusion. So my primary aim was to examine how social capital can contribute to our understanding of shrinking cities. And I wanted to understand how it was transformed and how it was used in the context of shrinkage. And I started by highlighting these two different approaches to social capital in shrinking cities, which I tried to connect. And what my findings show is that first, social capital is very much affected by the changes related to shrinkage, and it is weakened, especially informal social capital. But when it's there, it is a critical resource to deal with some of the difficulties related to shrinkage, at least at the individual level. So not really, at least at the individual level. And eventually, I highlight the role of social actors like community centers in addressing this weakening and this uneven distribution of social capital. So these findings, they suggest different ways through which policy can use social capital in shrinking cities. Not only by relying on organized communities, but also supporting social actors in their role of fostering social capital, and not seeking only to solve city-level problems, but also by addressing social well-being at the individual level. And I think this is quite important because a tendency in shrinking cities is to prioritize major urban redevelopment plans that aim to tackle shrinkage, to solve the problems at city level. And then because of the scarcity of financial resources, this often impacts negatively the community actors like the community center I was studying. And these findings, on the other hand, they highlight the importance of these community actors in addressing some problems related to shrinkage, but just they do it in a way that is less visible. And with this, I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy to answer any question.
Great, thanks for the presentation, Solène.
Thank you. I will maybe escape the screen.
Yeah, you can do that.
Yeah.
So we'll take some questions and comments if anybody would like to either raise your hand within Zoom. You can find that under the reactions button, or you can post in the chat. And when we come to you, if you could unmute yourself to ask your question. Alternatively, if you're not in a position to unmute yourself and to ask the question yourself, I'd be quite happy to read it out on your behalf. Just indicate that in the chat if that's the case. So we have a little bit of time for questions. Thought I might start with the first one, which is probably more of an observation that your research highlights something that is so important and perhaps not particularly well understood about the role of urban shrinkage and the way in which we might be able to change the social environment that occurs as part of that process. Because you've seemed to have highlighted what is potentially a very negative cycle in urban centers that are shrinking, where you have that erosion of social networks as people leave. And so rather than people's networks becoming bigger or perhaps maintaining in their size, a lot of people's networks perhaps are actually shrinking in their size as a result of people leaving. And people may be able to go out and meet new people and maintain the size of their networks. But like you're saying, it also tends to be associated with higher rates of mobility as well. And so people the research quite strongly supports the idea that in areas of high mobility, people don't tend to actually try to meet their neighbors and try to meet their friends because they figure, well, what's the point? They're probably going to move on in a few months' time, or in 6 months from now, they'll move anyway, and I will have tried to make friends with people, and then they'll be gone anyway. So if we have that process of eroding networks that aren't being replenished and replaced as a result of mobility or the possibility of mobility, and at the same time, you highlighted the impoverishment as well, and that being a driver of, I guess, both reduced abilities to realize the benefits of social capital, that if the general community has less resources, assets, things that they can share and mobilize within the community, then there can be fewer beneficial outcomes of social capital. And at the same time, people may be not able to socialize quite as much. And so it seems like we have this almost like a negative cycle that simply perpetuates itself, where social capital declines, that sense of place perhaps becomes more negative. People then potentially are more likely to move away from the area, and it kind of just gets worse. So that's a very long summary, I think, perhaps of the way that I've understood some of your research findings. If you have any comment on the accuracy of what I've just said.
No, but that summarizes it pretty well. And what I find interesting is that how this doesn't happen in a homogeneous way. So among my respondents, I met a lot of people who were very integrated and would not have the same experience as what I was describing. So depending on your social background and your age, and your geographical trajectory, you might not have the same experience at all. But this issue of isolation was definitely a very present issue, especially with the population groups that I described. And it does have very important effects in people's lives. And I think I was a little bit frustrated when I started this research with a maybe overly optimistic view of social capital that I was reading in shrinkage-related research on how social capital could do so many great things. But I saw also many people who were struggling. So we're not involved in all these great grassroots organizations and community-led initiatives. So that's what drove me to try to investigate the other side of the coin, basically. But I don't want to monopolize so maybe there are other questions that
there are a couple of other questions coming up, but if we just stay on that for a moment longer, I think the unequal access is so important to highlight how, particularly you talked about the elderly, who, when their social network erodes and perhaps gets smaller, it may be much more difficult for them to increase the size of their network to meet new people. And that may not be the case for people in other areas of society, say younger people or people who are actively working. In some of the social capital research, it focuses on perhaps the limit that you can only know so many people. Like once you get beyond 150 people, it's hard to remember people's names and faces and keep it all together. And that's a very optimistic view of what social capital may look like. And clearly in areas where, shrinking cities and urban areas, it's far more likely to be that you've only got half a dozen friends, and then some of them start moving away and it actually gets smaller and smaller. And it's certainly not a problem with remembering people's names and faces at the other end of the scale. So highlighting that, I think, is really important. And like you said, that there tends to be an assumption that social capital is this effectively free available resource that city planners and policymakers can take advantage of, can make use of to improve social outcomes. But it's just as likely for urban shrinkage to result in a negative view of place that ultimately results in very negative social capital and negative outcomes, and a reduced ability to produce positive benefits of outcomes. So that's just as likely, or perhaps more likely, to occur in urban shrinkage than for people to come together with a shared sense of purpose or a shared goal to overcome the challenges of urban shrinkage, which is another possible way in which social capital could be strengthened. But like you said, that really needs to be done through those more formal social capital processes, where it's more explicit that they're coming together. Here is our purpose, and we can get behind it, and we can have that common sense of identity behind that goal.
Yeah. I have several thoughts coming up with your comments. The first one is, well, about this the fact that I mentioned elderly people mostly, and really I want to highlight how in people's accounts the transition to retirement was a crucial moment, and in the negative sense, because it's also a moment of, well, yeah, suddenly the social network erodes a lot, but also it's a moment of sources of social recognition, so also of symbolic capital, suddenly change and sometimes disappear. So this can really be a triggering point, but really also in the cases that I saw at the community center, it was an individual life event, a difficult life event. And secondly, about what you were saying at the end on getting involved in shrinking cities, I think this. So I very briefly mentioned it at the beginning of the presentation. There's also research that shows that there is also weakening of more formal forms of social capital, because sometimes people in shrinking cities, well, either they're in a situation where economic survival is more important. So this is the priority, and getting involved in community projects is not. Or also there's something we have to imagine, that we're talking about trends that happen over, half a century. So when it's been happening for several generations and you're used to your place being like that, that doesn't mean you're not attached and satisfied to your place. Well, you also get used to how it is, and you don't necessarily feel the urge to change the place or to address some problems. So some problems are seen as very problematic by policymakers, but not so much by residents. It's not really part of their everyday life. So, and that also was the reason why I was specifically investigating how shrinkage translates in people's everyday life, because it's not the same experience as that of policymakers. And maybe the last thing, what I find very interesting in the French context is this role of social actors, because there's a lot of shrinkage research that is on more, let's say, neoliberal contexts. There's a lot in the US, for instance. So there's not so much research where the welfare state is still quite present. And the community center that old community centers that I studied in my research, they were funded by the National Agency for Housing and Social Allowances, basically, and the municipality. So it's mostly public funding, and they have employees and they work quite professionally because of this public funding. So this research also shows that, well, the crucial role of public support, basically, in comparison to other contexts which were more frequently documented, where public support is, non-existent. So the inhabitants really have to resort to DIY, basically. So this shows what public funding can do, basically.
Yeah, I think you make a really great point too, that the lived experience of the people who live in those areas may be entirely different than what the policymakers think it is. Like if it has been undergoing urban shrinkage for 100 years, then the perceptions of what that means may be altogether different than what we may think sitting remotely and observing that and thinking, wow, how terrible is this that the place is shrinking and people moving away. But if that's been fact of life and the lived reality for the last 100 years, then the lived experience may be altogether different. I think that's a really important point you've made. We could talk for hours. I love talking. I'm a geographer. I love talking with other geographers. But there are other questions. I see Branagh has a hand up, but we do have a question in the chat first from Rizik. Rizik, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you could ask the question yourself, or I'd be happy to ask it on your behalf.
Yes, thank you, Tristan and Solène. So I'm just wondering about a few points about the impoverishments that you're pointing about the reduce of the access of the social network. So I'm just wondering, is that in your research also identify about the useful about the digital platforms, like how that people can connect it using the technologies, yes, to increase the access to the social networks. So yes, that is my curious questions about that. So hopefully can be answering, or yes, depend on your research. That is my questions, Tristan and Solène. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so if I understand well, you're wondering about, in terms of reduced access to social networks or social activities, what digital networks could have, how this could play out in this. So I have several thoughts coming to me. Well, the first thing is that in terms of reduced access, this was mostly related to the ability to pay for paid activities. Not so much in terms of the networks themselves. The problem with the networks were more their erosion. Well, the first obvious thing that I'm thinking right now is that since I observed this problem mostly with elderly people, the digital networks were a little bit out of the picture. And this is also something, actually, this is a topic that did come out several times in interviews, they were sort of aware of, so the elderly respondents I'm talking about, they were sort of aware of the possibilities that these tools could possibly bring them, and definitely sometimes using it with their family. But also this awareness was very uncertain and blurry. So basically for most of them, they didn't master social networks and digital social networks, and they didn't know how to use it. And this was one of the issues. And they were also aware of this limitation. So that was sort of a concern. And actually, for the anecdote, the community center offers courses in digital literacy. They offer courses to help people learn how to use a computer, learn how to use a tablet. So I had conversations on, yeah, I have this tablet, my children gave it to me, but I'm not using it. I don't know how, I'm trying, no. So this came out mostly in terms of limitation for more elderly people. And then there is also a sort of like place-based community identity that exists on social networks with like Facebook groups and things like that. But to say that this translates in social life or social capital that is primarily emerging from digital networks, this I cannot really say. This is not something I observed. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you, Solène. That is clear for me. Yeah, because I'm also interested on your research designs. There is a bit similar with Indonesian context that mostly in urban right now is mostly happening. It's like a displacements that, yes, the elderly people is the most discriminated groups. It's not only because the displacements of the housings, but also the government's givings like idea just using the digital platform that hopefully can giving a solutions for the elderly, for example. But yes, the fact is the elderly is still difficult to access or to using the many digital platform that providing by the public service, for example. Yes, thank you so much, Solène's presence on this.
If I can just maybe add some tiny thing. The digital platforms also helped me connecting with people who had no social connection at all. Because through Facebook groups, posts in Facebook groups, or a survey that I circulated, I could reach people who were active on social networks, but didn't have connections in real life. So that was also something.
Okay, interesting. Let's move on to the next question from Branko. Feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question or make a comment.
Thanks. It's a mixture of question and a comment. I'm starting soon studies on urban development. I really appreciate your presentation and your work, Solène. It's very, very interesting, and it's something that we are not talking enough about, and especially in the context of how we use the money of the welfare state to do something about our cities. I think there is a question, especially after lockdowns, why are we living in cities now? I'm from Croatia, and here I can see in smaller cities another layer on shrinkage, which on the first look, it's not a shrinkage at all. Cities are prospering, there are lots of buildings being built and so on. But the thing is that there are this development, which is only built development, is actually driven by investments in tourism. And it's, in my opinion, this seasonal fluctuation of economic activity in these cities is diluting the social capital even more, because for at least 4 months a year, maybe 6 months a year, the city is functioning in one mode, and then it's functioning in another mode. And I guess that I would like to look into that, as soon as something is accomplished during winter months, then come summer months, and you put all that away, and there is quite a different atmosphere in the city and different happenings. Since Dieppe is on the seaside, did you see some effects of tourism? I don't know about Nevers, maybe it's also, it looks pretty. I don't know how touristy it is, so I'm asking more about Dieppe.
Yeah, both cities are pretty, but indeed Dieppe is much more touristic than Nevers because of the seaside. Tourism in Dieppe is definitely seen as something positive because it's a source of economic activity, and it sort of took over from industrial activities that do not provide as much employment as it used to. So it's seen as something. For instance, tourism is one of the reasons that in Dieppe shrinkage, or there is less of a feeling of decline, or a sensation of decline, because it makes a lot of things much less visible. So for instance, the decline is not so much in the commercial activity of the city center, but it's more in the impoverishment of the population. So this is less visible. So tourism is mostly seen as something positive, but there is one particularity in Dieppe. It's one of the only cities that since the heydays of industrial times remained governed by a communist government. And I think this played an important role on how tourism was developed in the city, because the city first never had a very active policy to develop tourism. So even I think it was in the 2000s, the slogan for the municipal list before the elections was Dieppe aux Dieppois, so Dieppe to its inhabitants, meaning not to the tourists. And I think indirectly some of the consequences of that is that there's been less well, there's been more money invested for the inhabitants directly, you know, social organizations, cultural organizations, sport organizations, and less in, you know, economic development. Well, in terms of, you know, the impact that tourism can create on local inhabitants, you know, in terms of real estate markets, prices, the city being suddenly overflowed with tourists, I think there's been less of a feeling of dispossession for the local inhabitants in relation to tourism. So the two activities work better together. Of course, you know, investing less in economic development also has consequences, and some people would strongly criticize that in the city. But let's say that, yeah, tourism was basically not a priority, and social policy were much more the priority. So yeah, this has led to a specific, you know, social and policy landscape in this city. I get my first thought when you started your comment is that there are two main things that can happen when tourism is so important, and suddenly when the season started takes over. It's first the access to housing and access to the, well, when you basically cannot access a neighborhood anymore, even if you're from there, because now real estate markets are too high for you. But there's also something in the occupation of public space, I guess, because maybe a lot of social activity happens in the open, and suddenly when the public space is fully taken over by tourists, maybe there's a sense of loss of belonging for the local inhabitants. But I wouldn't say that this is happening in Dieppe.
I think it's fascinating. I was reading some research out of the UK that suggested that locals love the tourists because they would bring in money, and of course there's employment opportunities and so forth. But they didn't want the tourists to be, say, winning the meat prize at the local pub. You know, so the tourists could do certain things, and they had a certain role, and they could be in certain spaces, but perhaps not in other spaces. And when we think about the way in which social capital forms and the way in which social interaction occurs in a geographic sense, it's that mix of public and private spaces that seems to be so important, that you've got those completely public spaces where anyone can come and anyone can socialize and interact. But then you have the mix of semi-private and private spaces as well, which seems to be a really important place for social capital to occur, particularly where you have a high number of tourists. And so if you're in a completely public space, you may not know who's a local and who's not. And in fact, in many cases, a lot of the other people perhaps aren't locals. And people know that trying to meet somebody and develop a relationship with a tourist isn't going to necessarily lead to a long-term relationship that is beneficial in any kind of way. And so it's that mix of spaces that I think is important. And I think there's perhaps a lot more research to be done on that, and how we shape the built environment to facilitate the maximum, I guess, or to accentuate the possibility for social capital to be maintained and developed.
Yeah, I think this question of public or private space and semi-public space is quite important. If I think of Dieppe again, for instance, there's something interesting going on with the seaside, the beachfront, which most Dieppois, most locals really praise and are really attached to. So the seaside is a very important place for all the people living there, and yet at the same time it is, let's say from an external point of view, very much in need of renovation. So it hasn't been redeveloped in a very long time, and I think from a urban planning point of view, you'd say it's a major priority. This should definitely be redeveloped. So I thought it was very interesting to to observe this sort of like contradiction, and this. I also could observe that people from different social backgrounds in the city didn't have the same opinion also on this place. So and the same practices as well. So there were more people from more middle class, upper middle class backgrounds who were more critical of this place, and who also went to other beachfronts outside the city. Yeah, and as for the semi-public places, I come back again to the community centers. I really saw them as a critical space for social interaction. But it's interesting because they're also so important because they are old. They've been there forever, and people are used to these places. It's approachable. When they try different initiatives, of course, it's new. People don't really know if they're allowed. For instance, if they try to sort of open like a community cafe, it's much more, uncertain, the outcome, because people don't, the place needs to be well identified. And even then, so several people thought that the community center was not for them because they were not, poor people in need. So so they didn't allow themselves to go. So that was also an issue. So I guess the accessibility of places is and this includes their appearance, is a quite important point.
Yeah, and I think just to expand on that a little more as well, it's that the spaces may be owned publicly or privately, and access may be public or private in terms of the control or the availability of it. And so to give a few examples, somebody's own home is a private space that is also private access, whereas a cafe is privately owned, but it's public access. And so it's the variety and mix of these spaces that provides the opportunity for different types of social interactions. And so I think you've made some really great points. If we expand on this a little bit more, I don't think it was exactly the focus of your research, but you touched on the idea of perception of place and the way that people feel about place, therefore shaping the nature of social interaction that may occur in that place. The attitudes that they have towards where they live also shaping attitudes they have towards other people who live in that space as well and interact within it. And I think it's very easy for us to look at a location that is undergoing shrinkage and say that must be a terrible place to look. And I think this gets to the idea again about policymakers looking at it may not really understand what the lived experience is. But I think at the same time, if we look at some of the fast-growing urban areas, say if I look around where I live in Brisbane, there's some very fast-growing urban areas, and the perception of place is much more negative than I would imagine the perception of place would be in some of these places that are undergoing urban shrinkage. And so I was wondering if you had much, like any other observations through your research about the nature of that perception of place and how it isn't necessarily as bad as outsiders like myself perhaps thinks that it may be.
Yeah, very interesting question. Thank you for asking it. One of my favorite topics. Yes. So initially, the first two topics I really wanted to look at when I started this research were social capital and place attachment. And in the end, place attachment is not so much a central topic in this research, because during the research, what came up was that yes, the overly dominant discourse was that people were attached to their place. Some people were less attached, but this came with, sort of like, yeah, they were not from there, they were just passing, or this was not so much of a topic. But what is certain is that indeed there was a gap between what we can see and think of these places from the outside when we read about their problems and the local experience. And the local experience was far more positive than what we might expect when reading in quantitative terms about these cities. So this is, yeah, like unconditional, like is definitely a fact. It's sort of like it was an initial puzzle because I could sense that definitely the experience of place and the experience of place was positive in most cases. The attachment to place was strong. And yet there was a lot of discourse on this image of place, perception of place, quality of life. For instance, the first thing that struck me was that people insisted a lot on quality of life, explaining why they were living here, why they chose to live here, why the place was good, all the advantages of the place. So this, at the beginning, was a little bit like puzzling to me because on the one hand, there seemed to be like an agreement on something, but at the same time, a topic that triggered people. And eventually what I understood was that there was an issue with this negative representation of place, which is mostly something that comes from outside. And in the end, what the notion that I mostly explored was the notion of territorial stigmatization. So there is definitely an issue with these places around territorial stigmatization, around the fact that there are negative imaginaries, stigmatizing imaginaries constructed around these places, and mostly from actors that are not from these places. So like the national media and so it's really something that is affecting local residents, and that they try to counteract with this very positive discourse on place. The positive discourse is a strategy. It's a strategy to deconstruct the stigmatizing imaginaries, especially when talking to me, because I'm the outsider who's going to write about their city. Yeah, and there's something very interesting that I observed during the study. It's that in interviews, people would defend their city, all its advantages, explain why they were super happy, super satisfied with their place. But they also said, yeah, all other people criticize. Other people say that, yeah, the city is going downhill, that things are bad, but I disagree with them. They shouldn't say that, and I disagree. The city is not so bad. It has plenty of things to offer. We have everything we need here. And then when I was in groups, but I was not identified as a researcher, as it happened when I was more in situations of ethnographic observation, people didn't always knew who I was. Then I would hear this critical discourse. So eventually I understood that mitigating the negative, so there is a negative discourse. Some people internalize the negative imaginaries and they reproduce it and they criticize the place, but they don't do it in front of the interviewer. So in front of the interviewer, the strategy is to mitigate the stigmatization by emphasizing the positive aspects of place. Yeah, I could go on and on, but yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. And reflecting on my own experience when I was living in Dunedin, everyone else in New Zealand thinks the weather in Dunedin is terrible. And so people who live in Dunedin take every opportunity they can to talk about how fantastic the weather is whenever it is good. And push back on and say, you know, like, if only the rest of the country knew just how great it was down here. So I think we can see the same sort of thing happening all over the place. And I am really interested in, it doesn't sound like we exactly have an answer, but I'm really interested in how just because there's a narrative that pushes back against that negative that negative perception that might exist from outsiders, just because there's a positive narrative doesn't mean that negative narrative is still not having an effect. A few double negatives there. But it's obviously very complex, the way that there's a positive narrative and a negative narrative, and they obviously interact with each other in ways that produce potentially some positive and some negative outcomes at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. In Nevers, especially, which is more affected by this issue of stigma than Dieppe, there's even a local word, which is Niévrose, and it's a combination of Nièvre, so that's the name of the region where Nevers is located, and neurosis. and it means the depression that you get from living there. And it's really a combination of attachment to place, but anxiety because it's going downhill, depression because there's nothing to do. So the fact that this term exists is very significant. But of course, it's not used by everyone, and many people actually mention it to criticize it. So it's I also don't think we have an answer on how this exactly articulates, except what I found, that it's also a strategy to mitigate stigma. But there are definitely both things playing side to side.
And these sorts of things can represent an identity that can bring people together and form a sense of shared purpose and goals. If locals all are experiencing shrinkage and decline and impoverishment and services shutting down and businesses leaving, people leaving, then that's a commonality that can actually bring people together and potentially have some positive effects in that's social, societal level. So it's I guess for urban planners, it'd be great if they could look at how that sense of identity and shared purpose could be maximized to improve the benefits that could come from social capital, rather than putting all their efforts into fixing the cracked pavements and and urban development initiatives that don't necessarily fix any of the things that we're talking about. Just because there's some new pavement on the road doesn't mean people feel any different about place.
That summarizes some of my key points very well. Yeah. Yes, I do agree very much with this. And in terms of what the collective identity and sense of place involves or can create, I was thinking that, well, my research focused on shrinking cities, but there is also ongoing increasing talk on left behind places, which is, I mean, they're not always equivalent, but in my case, we're talking about places that correspond to the definition of left behind regions or places. I think in this framework, this experience of place, sense of place, place identity is also very important, because it can both, and I think the expression left behind immediately touches more on this, I'm forgetting the words that you used exactly, but on this aspect of how you feel about place and how you feel collectively as a local community in this place. Because the term left behind says it all. And it also mentions that there is something that can be negative, because when we're talking about left behind places, mostly we're talking about, I mean, most of this research has been talking about discontent, but I think the results that I highlight can also bring this more positive aspect of the narrative to this issue of discontent. So now with this topic, we're touching on, bigger issue, because it's very linked with political results, political behavior. I think there is not just discontent. There's contentment with the place and discontent at how the place is considered.
Yeah. There's a little town in New Zealand called Ahura, which is where they've embraced the idea of being left behind. And it's a fascinating example. I don't know that it's been any academic literature has been published on it, but it's a fascinating example because it got to the point where all the shops had shut. And I think there was about 10, 12 people living in the town. And that's how small it got. And then they embraced the idea that they were left behind. They named the highway the Forgotten Highway. They embraced the idea that they were very remote and that no one lived there anymore. And then all of a sudden, there started to be urban development. There started to be people moving there. There was interest in it, and it started growing again. And last I heard, it was up to about 50 or 60 people moving to this very remote, very rural location that was about to disappear off the map altogether. And so it's that perception. Well, I think it was the narrative. I think the locals embraced the idea of being left behind, of being forgotten, called it the Forgotten Highway. It started to become more of a tourist destination, like it got to the point where it was so bad it couldn't get any worse. There were no shops in town anymore, so it could only go up from there. And so I think this speaks to the power of how we perceive place can have a massive influence on how we interact with others and how others come to see the place. And that has obviously a lot of implications for urban development and for urban planning. And that's just one example. I'm sure there's many other examples where things have turned around purely because of the attitudes that people have towards it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think in the literature on urban shrinkage, there is a strong criticism of the what they call entrepreneurial urban policies that aim to redevelop the city at all costs, regrow it, and attract external entrepreneurs, external families, middle-class families, ideally. And I mostly agree with this critique because it does raise issues in terms of social spatial justice and effectiveness again. But what I could see from my perspective during my study was that basically I mentioned the policy in Dieppe, but the policy in Nevers is quite the opposite of Dieppe. It's very much entrepreneurial, very much trying to attract startup companies, qualified professionals. So very much in this vein of entrepreneurial municipal policies. And the interesting thing that I could observe was that it also spoke to the people, the local people, in terms of image. So the issue was not so much does it work or not, which is the answer that the literature tries to answer. And I sort of agree with the literature that it doesn't really work. But for the locals, it meant our city is moving forward, future-oriented, innovative, and even for people who were very remote from these economic sectors, like, for instance, elderly people, it spoke to them sometimes very positively as a modern place, basically, a place moving forward, turned dynamic, etc. So this was the very positive aspect for them.
Yeah. It's so important. Those attitudes are so important. So I wonder, are there any further questions from the audience? There was a comment in the chat about, is there an opportunity for urban renewal or sustainable development because of urban shrinkage? So I know you've been talking about that a bit already. If you haven't, any other thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess the question meant specifically urban renewal, but in a sustainable way, right? From what I understand. Well, yeah. So there is this is a little bit outside the scope of my own research, since I was mostly looking at everyday experiences for residents and everyday negotiation strategies, so more informally than urban policy. That being said, this is a strong hypothesis that is formulated in the literature on urban shrinkage, and it's often gathered under the term of greening shrinking cities, greening redevelopment. This has been part of a major part of the urban strategies that have been implemented in many shrinking cities. Mostly because there is an abundance of brownfields. So there is an opportunity to create green space. But this is also a very, very tricky issue because there are many difficulties to that. For instance, brownfields are generally polluted. So the first solution that comes to mind is make it a park. But it's often very costly, very difficult, and not always possible to make it a park when it's the soil is heavily polluted. When it's possible, then it raises issues in terms of gentrification and increasing inequality or increasing segregation in the city, because it creates highly attractive places, and the people who are more deprived in these places are completely excluded from these redevelopments. So because of course the goal is to make the real estate market dynamic again. So and to raise real estate values. So the houses are for private sector in general. The houses that are, for instance, redeveloped nearby parks. And then this is specific to the US. There's been also a lot of ideas around the fact that since places were almost abandoned in some parts of it, why not make them go back to nature, basically? So take out the highways, destroy the houses, tear down everything, and let's give it back to forests well, I think that's there's sort of two aspects to that. On the one hand, we're reaching like very innovative ideas of that it does sound great, and when it's possible, I do think it's great if for instance, in the case of a highway that has been completely abandoned and not maintained anymore, why not take it out? Indeed. This is a case that doesn't exist in France, by the way, not only in the US. But often what was a little bit overlooked in these propositions was that there were still people living in these places. And generally, the most marginalized communities were living in these very sparsely populated areas. So deciding from one day to the next that the area is cancelled and people have to relocate to an entirely other part of the city, this is also problematic. And in general, these theoretical ideas and these plans, they haven't been implemented fully because it raises too many problems of relocating people against their will, basically. So yeah, there's been a whole range of greening redevelopment strategies theorized and experimented, from the most low-key to the most radical.
Yeah, certainly a challenge and something that we might need to do more of in the future. So let's wrap up this session. Solène, we really appreciate all the time and effort you've put into presenting this. It's really fascinating research that you've done. It's been great to hear about it.
Yeah, it's been a great opportunity to talk about it as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. So our webinar series continues next week. We have Dr. Shanar Rashid, who's going to be talking about social capital and financial reporting. The value of social relationships can now appear on a financial statement. So that sounds like it'll be an interesting presentation. And then we're going to take about a month break from the webinar series, and then we'll pick back up again in July. So great, everyone could attend. Thanks again, Solène. I look forward to the next one.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.